We will begin our session in just a minute. Good morning or good afternoon. I'm Rob Grimes. I'm the CEO of the International Food and Beverage Technology Association, IFBTA, and I'm very happy this afternoon to welcome you to a conversation on labor shortage or wage shortage. And this is put on by the food shows, the Western, Florida, and International Food Show of New York, and the Healthy Food Expo. And today, our session is sponsored also by somebody who has an interest in this area, a very specific interest in this area, from WorkStream. WorkStream is a hiring platform and a mobile app that streamlines the sourcing, screening, and onboarding of hourly workers. Especially with today's labor costs and labor crisis, WorkStream has been critical in helping over 10,000 hiring managers from brands like Subway, Chick-fil-A, Marriott keep their stores staffed. And I will tell you that is certainly going to be the discussion that we're going to have today. But before we get started, let me go ahead and introduce the IFBTA to you. The International Food and Beverage Technology Association is a not-for-profit trade association that's focused, obviously, in food and beverage technology, in all areas, by the way. And we focus on the promotion, networking, and education for our members. Our members are both suppliers and operators. Everyone has an equal seat at the table because we've discovered that the sharing of information and technology really goes a long way. And in today's world, technology, as we know, has become the center of enabling a lot of food service operations to not only weather the past 18 months, but also to grow their businesses. And that's going to be part of what we'll talk about today. The IFBTA has a global reach through regional and local chapters, and we do a lot of industry events, both virtually and in person as they exist. We have a certification program in Certified Food Service Technology Professional, and we do a lot of industry partnerships and support as the one we have with the food shows themselves. A few ground rules and just some housekeeping for today. If you have questions, we are going to have an open Q&A session for the last 10 to 15 minutes. You should submit those questions via the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. You can go ahead and specify which speaker you'd like to answer, but since we only have one speaker, I suggest that you specify Michael to be the one you'd like to answer the question, and I can provide some color commentary as well. We would ask that you stay away from questions regarding sales, pricing, political discussions, and any disparaging remarks. And you will be muted throughout the session, so if you want to use the chat, you can share your comments and communicate with both the organizer and the panel. And of course, following this webinar, it will be available via foodandbeverageshows.com, the IFBTA.org, and also on social media. And again, I want to thank WorkStream for helping us to put this together today. So with that, let me go ahead and introduce our speaker. And Michael Lastoria, who is the CEO and founder and CEO of, the co-founder and CEO of And Pizza. And Michael, if you'd join us on screen, that would be great. Great, welcome, Michael. And we're going to just start with, we're going to have a chat, but really I think it would be helpful if you would give us an idea of your background, a little bit of And Pizza, and why don't we start with that?
Sure, thanks for having me, Rob, and I hope everybody virtually listening has some really good questions for me. Don't hold anything back, throw it all on the table. And for those that follow me know that, you know, I love very challenging questions, but you're always going to get direct and response. So quick background myself. I grew up, I always like to tell the real backstory, which I grew up in a small country town of 500 people, 60 miles south of Buffalo. So when I could make my way to New York City at 22 years old, I did. I was looking for the exact opposite of where I grew up. And it's funny because my town, it was actually a hamlet. There was only one flashing light and one bar. I went to the same building from kindergarten through 12th grade, my public graduating class being 35 people. So we're talking about very, very, very rural America. And the reason I bring that up is because it does help inform my policies and how I think about the working class, uniting the working class, and a lot of labor policy giving. I grew up in a very blue collar community. At 22, I could only get a job in sales. I lasted 6 weeks in a boiler room making 350 cold calls a day, realized that was not going to be it. So I was able to start my first business, got really lucky, was able to sell it at 26 in that business. And Rob will appreciate that. It was really focused on advertising technology and media services. Spent about 3 years going through two acquisitions and a merger post that, reporting into private equity. And when my 3-year contract was up, having sold majority control of my business, I was out. And then I took my passions to the creative services world and built an advertising agency with one of my best friends and business partners, Doug Jacob. We built that creative services agency and ended up selling that in 2017 to a large Japanese beauty holding company. So you can imagine two guys with big beards, working in the beauty space. And I found myself in Tokyo for the first time, doing business with a very, very, very tried and true 100-year-old Japanese company. It was a lot of fun. But along the way, developed a deep passion for brand building, but also along the way, really, really, really wanted to build my own version of a consumer brand that I felt reflected the person that I aspired to be, and really took in all of the data points that I had learned as a young professional in New York, and also the way that I was raised. And so I always knew that I wanted to do something that would help unite the working class. I always wanted to do something that would help provide good jobs in this country. And I always had this big idea that it was going to be based around the symbol that was the ampersand. So the and started well before the pizza. When I started doing research around what was the actual industry going to be, I came across a couple of stats. Number one, the food service industry employs 10% of America's workforce. That's a pretty big and important data point, because when you think about America historically, we were largely a manufacturing country, and manufacturing jobs paid on average $25, $26 an hour. And those have been replaced by food service jobs that now pay on average around $10, $11 an hour. So part of the income inequality is actual structural, is just a shift in industry of what is the largest employer in the US. And then when you double click on food service, the restaurant industry is the second largest private employer outside of the federal government. And so the notion of uniting the working class around fair wages, good jobs, I thought the best place to do that is food service, because it's the fastest growing and the most important industry in America as an employer. And when I chose pizza, that was just wildly opportunistic. When I looked at the top 50 pizza chains in America, I thought there's a lot of opportunity here, as many of them have been around for 30, 40, 50 years and just existed because they existed. With supply chain being a bit dated, the philosophy on, the employee relationship was a little bit contorted. And I just knew that if we could do something the right way and we could build a brand that was based around taking care of your employees, having a very healthy and clean supply chain, or at least as healthy and clean as you can in pizza, and really just upending the game, building our own software stack, and taking all of the best learnings from Big Pizza, applying the same sort of quality and integrity that you see in the mom and pop, that we could do something special. And that was really the start of it. I was in New York. We rented out an art studio in West Chelsea, figured out we could make
You were in New York, by the way, at the center of pizza, right? So like, if you're going to go into any business in New York and you don't want to have any competitors, you go into pizza.
Yeah, it was a bit crazy, but we wanted to we wanted to make our mark, and we wanted to make sure that we could compete against some of the toughest pizza concepts in the world. For me, it's always stacking the deck against me, because if we feel like we can succeed, then there's a real reason to scale something, not necessarily scaling mediocrity, but scaling something that's got, a real point of view and can work in the toughest market. So opened up our first pizza shop in July of 2012 in Washington, D.C. There's a lot of reasons we can get into later if time permits. And, we opened up, call it our 55th pizza shop last week. And we are going to open another right around 15 locations this year alone. And then we have a pipeline of 30 in 2022 and about 40 locations in 2023. and we've been able to raise over $100 million of growth capital. More recently, we raised $55 million intra-COVID in the middle of a pandemic. And so a lot of what we've done has been just being smart and thoughtful around the architecture of the business, but also busting our ass and figuring out how to make it work when we had no idea what true north looked like. So I'm happy to be here, thankful to have made it through at least closer to the other side of the pandemic, as hopefully in the next 6 to 12 months we can move to endemic levels and all battle Delta to the best of our abilities. And just thanks for having me, Rob.
Well, so your description actually has brought up a number of different things. I got to give you an observation, but I will tell you that talk about being, so I want to say at the right place at the right time, but I'm not sure that that comes out exactly the right way. But if you're going to pick an industry to be in during a pandemic, it probably is going to be something like pizza, which, as we know, the pizza industry may have been impacted the least in this because they were prepared to do delivery and pickup, but not all pizza places actually did online ordering. Second to that, the other piece that we found that the pandemic has brought to the restaurant industry is technology. And yet you already had that behind you, and you were able to build your own tech stack, as you said. And this is not a conversation about those. But what it is a conversation is about labor. And my third observation for you would be that people will always say, life would be perfect in our industry without employees and without customers. And yet it appears to me that you have chosen to go into this industry because you want to make an impact. And you want to make an impact on the labor side very specifically. And so you picked an industry that, as you've already pointed out, almost everyone has worked in at one point or another, employs a lot, that you felt that you could marry the things that you were passionate about in order to make an impact. Would that be, it wasn't the pizza first, but it was the...
No, and it's on all 3 points, I think, to address the first. I mean, one of the things I think people should know is that we were not necessarily the beneficiary of the sort of high level industry trends that you saw with Papa John's and Domino's performing exceptionally well. Their business has been over 80% off premise historically. Our business was actually 2/3 of our customer walking into a pizza shop, queuing up in a line, and ordering a pizza, whether that be for dine-in or takeout. And so we basically lost 2/3 of our business overnight. It was the investments that we made very early on in the first week of the pandemic, increased our employees' wages. We guaranteed them hours, whether we could actually use their labor or not, we still paid them. We modified our health policy and safety policy. We made it really easy for people not to come to work. We struck a deal with Lyft, and we paid and subsidized transportation from our employees to get from where they worked to the pizza shops. We used our pizza to feed families and communities and healthcare workers. And we basically did everything that we could to try to relieve stress and pressure, or at least financial stress and pressure, from our workforce in a time and a place where people were hiding their cash or hiding their balance sheet under their mattress. We spent big, and we spent over $2 million in making sure that our workforce was protected. And that was a huge investment. And I'll tell you, no one knew whether that was going to be a good or a bad investment. And the conversation I had with our shareholders and boards is very rare for a company to be able to truly live its North Star. People always question, like, there has to be some business incentive at the other side of doing good, right? And there has to be some reason for it. And I said, look, in good times we invest in our people, in bad times we invest in our people. It's just the nature of the company we're going to do it. And so we had a workforce that was incredibly engaged, incredibly active, showed up like I've never seen before, kept as many of our doors open, fought the hell of a fight. That, coupled with the fact that, to your point earlier, number two, we did build our own software stack. And so we have a text message communications platform similar to WorkStream, which I think is super cool, and that it acted as a massive customer acquisition engine. So unlike a lot of restaurant businesses that try to generate sales via optimizing to the actual sale, every time someone's texting us, we're gathering robust data sets and the ability to learn more and more. And that enabled us to flood our system with inbound customers, eventually converting them into loyalty members. And that really helped us build back our business, going down from 2/3 to 1/3, all the way up to close to 100% and hurdling 100% over time. But it was really crazy. And to the last point around around this sort of employer-employee relationship, I will say that we did have the benefit of the intentionality of coming into this industry for a very specific reason. So everything that we did in terms of how we architected the concept allows us to pay higher wages, be very, very smart and thoughtful with labor productivity, and generate as much and create a workforce that's doing as much revenue producing labor as any other business out there. And we kept our operation super simple. And so there's a lot of things that we did that were kind of in the wood because of the fact that we were not going to do this unless we could pay high wages and take care of our workforce in a very specific way.
So you know what? So first of all, let me recognize that apparently there's a video problem, and while people are hearing us, they may or may not be able to see us. We're going to go ahead and keep the conversation going, and I know the team at Clarion is working on troubleshooting the video, and I can see Michael, and I assume he can see me. So we're going to keep going and with the conversation, and hopefully they'll get that cleared up as we're talking. Michael, you promised that any question is open. So why don't we just talk about some of the key things that are impacting us in labor right now? Mm-hmm. So I read a number of articles, and of course the title of what we're talking about today is whether we have a labor shortage or a wage shortage, but also you've been quoted before about that there isn't really a labor shortage, a shortage of businesses willing to pay decent wages, and you've said that a couple times. However, a year or two ago, people were all talking about that we needed to have a $15 minimum wage. And I don't hear that very much right now, because it appears that in the last 3 or 4 months, a lot of the restaurant companies have stepped up and are paying that or higher today because they felt that there was a labor shortage. And so I hear almost no discussion about the wage, because it seems like it's just become something that's there. I don't know how you feel about that, as to whether the market has now self-corrected on the wage, or there's something that we have to do there, because we still sort of hear about the labor shortages.
Yeah, it's a complicated question, and I try to break it down very simply. And I think a lot of people are learning more and more that it was not that much to do about the unemployment insurance, and a lot to do with people taking a step back and recognizing that the juice isn't worth the squeeze, and that the restaurant industry was not an ideal employer. And I think when you frame it sort of as a labor shortage, it ignores some of the real realities of the industry that I think personally need a hard reset. And I can tell you that millions of restaurant workers were fired or furloughed very early on in the pandemic. As I mentioned before, most restaurants, especially multi-unit, especially chain, they were not keeping their workforce or protecting their workforce. They were protecting their balance sheet. And those who weren't were often forced to put their health at risk by potentially exposing them to COVID-19 at work, or even worse, subjected to abuse by customers when they tried to enforce their shop's pandemic protocols. So I think what the pandemic really did was just highlight issues that have been problems in the restaurant industry for decades: lower wages, lack of benefits, dangerous working conditions, the cyclical nature of laying off and rehiring staff when it's convenient for the employer. I don't think these are necessarily new problems, but we need new solutions, because I think it was an article that actually came out today by the NRN that said that 66% of restaurant workers who are no longer working in the industry would return to the industry if there was change. And so from my perspective, at a very minimum, there needs to be a path to $15 an hour. There needs to be paid time off. There needs to be healthcare benefits. There needs to be better job stability. And I think the reason why I have confidence in sharing these things is because we at And Pizza over the last decade have developed a body of work, or quote unquote evidence, that supports the fact that we aren't dealing with a labor shortage. Right now, we've opened 15 new locations intra-COVID. We've received well over 100 applications for each location. Our locations are fully staffed, and we're not experiencing the same issues that a lot of our brothers and sisters in the industry are. Did you end up having to let people go?
Did you end up letting people go or closing units and reassigning people?
So what we did, we did have anywhere from 6 to 8 temporary closed locations, and we were able to reassign the hourly workers and or keep them on payroll. So no, we did not need to lay off or furlough our hourly working staff, or any staff for that matter at the company. But again, that was a very bold, and people would argue crazy, investment to make in a time and a place where you never knew if that investment was going to return what you put in.
Okay, so first of all, we're back online with video, which is great. So
Great.
I appreciate everybody standing by while you did. So I'd like to just drill down into something that you said. You know, clearly you have in your mind, besides the wage, I believe you said that there were 4 or 5 specific items that you think the industry should do. Now, maybe they're not doing it, but what is it that we are not talking about in labor that you believe that we should be doing?
Yeah, I mean, I had mentioned paid time off, healthcare, some version of job stability. I mean, there's a lot of them out there in terms of what people specifically care for, but I think those are the biggest ones, which is paid time off, healthcare benefits, and some version of job stability where you can't just cut that person. I mean, in corporate America, people ask for and they're disrespected when someone gives less than a 2 weeks notice. Yet the reality is people are losing shifts 30 minutes, 1 minute, 10 minutes after they arrive. There's zero job stability in our industry. And I think that's a massive problem. So I think it's just, it's dealing with, and also dealing with the dangerous working conditions, right? The sexual harassment. And it's really crazy because when you survey these workers, it's very clear that the pandemic was just a moment in time where they could breathe, take a step back, and recognize what it is they want to do and how they want to be treated. And our industry has not lived up to the task of stepping up and answering the call of duty and changing its practices to meet the workers where they are. And so workers are very much voting with their feet. And I understand that. I myself would not want to show up to work every day for a company that doesn't necessarily appreciate me. Even if they say it, it's what they do. And I think a lot of employers showed their version of true colors when the going got tough, that the workers were not the most important, that it was the company and protecting dollars, right, to make sure they could live to fight another day that mattered the most. And so those employees, they're just not as incentivized anymore. And so I actually think, I get a lot of, sort of negative inbound from this, but I think if there's anything that we can take away in the restaurant and food service industry, it's that this pandemic is going to force a hard reset that maybe we weren't prepared to. No different than Rob, than the fact that actually a lot of companies were forced to become better at technology, better at software. And I think it saved them from the death of 1,000 cuts because they actually made big investments in technology and they were being dragged right to the other side of history prior to. And I think they expedited and did 5 years worth of work in 5 months. And as a result, they're going to have a business in 10 years from now because of that, technological innovation and the forced change. I believe the same thing happens with labor. It's going to force our industry to change how it approaches labor. And that's going to then create a scenario where jobs are attractive, the industry can fulfill what it needs to fulfill in terms of the labor to meet the demand, and everyone is better off as a result of it. So it's sometimes
I think about this issue all the time, because I was, when we were talking before, I told you I'm a restaurant manager who happens to be in technology. I grew up in the restaurants and operations. One of the challenges that our industry has had, and you said this, you said that people who have left the industry said that they would like to come back. A large percentage would like to come back.
2/3.
But one of the challenges our industry has always had is how do we attract people to think that it's a industry of choice to begin with? We have parents that don't want their kids to go into the restaurant industry or the hotel industry for that matter as well, because it's hard work. The environment, as you've said, is what it is. On the other hand, I always found it to be, a very exciting thing, to be in touch with people to do something good. But how do we, through the labor opportunity we have now, how do we make it an industry of choice?
Well, look, I think it's been an industry of choice for a long time. I mean, nearly 1/3 of all Americans got their first job experience in a restaurant. Restaurants still to this day are the top employer of teenagers. And two stats that I love: 9 out of 10 managers in the restaurant industry, Rob, they start off as entry level. There's no other industry where you have that upward mobility than the restaurant industry. And that's what I love. Not to mention the restaurant industry employs more women and minority managers than any other industry. So to some extent, when you take some of the negative things I said, there's a lot of positive there, meaning that it's very rare to see those types of statistics. And so we are very progressive with employment. We're just not that progressive with employment policy. And so many good things happening underneath. It's how you repackage that. right? If I were to go on a mission and sort of reshape and rethink and rechange, those are the stats that I would use. I would show people very specific that this this industry is so impactful. It does so much good. It employs so many people. It's actually very progressive in terms of the way it thinks about upward mobility compared to other industry. You don't have to have higher education. It's beautiful. And as a result of that, I think it's packaging the good and then fixing some of the things that I would consider to be opportunities around wages and healthcare. And by the way, there are ways to do that where it's not just businesses footing the bill. The reality is.
Okay, so I was going to wait. I was going to ask. So first of all, you've said very clearly this is an industry of opportunity. So
Massive.
for all the reasons that you've said, a person can advance and do things, and a lot of things that hold them up. But how about the business side of it? How should we be changing the thinking of the operator when we talk about giving a paid time off? Even what you're doing, you said in your introduction, you're giving paid time off for people to be active in their community. So how do we balance that with good business, profitability, and by the way, if you're really one of the big guys, shareholders? How do we do that?
I would say that the experience that we have keeping people in the pizza shops for over a year has a massive impact to the P&L. For every quote unquote general manager, we call them shop leaders, for every year that they're on the job, I can guarantee 300 to 500 basis points, 3 to 5% increase in sales volume in that particular location for every GM that's been in that particular location for over a year. And I can break that down to hourly workers as well, which means that turnover is extremely expensive, right? It costs on average roughly $6,000 to replace an employee when you go through all of the recruiting, the onboarding, the training to get someone up to speed. And it has a massive negative drag on your top line sales and your bottom line four-wall margin. And so for us, as I mentioned before, 3 to 5% on the top line, that also translates to 2 to 3% in margin just through retention alone. So when you do the math on that, the actual money is there. It's just repurposing the dollars in terms of keeping people versus turning people over, and the incentives around what it looks like to take care of people. What I would also say, though, is that the government is subsidizing very oftentimes things that I think private companies should be paying for. But no matter how you look at it, think about universal healthcare. Imagine if you took healthcare away from the business. If the government footed the bill, we would be even more attractive of an industry to people to come to because it's fun. It's a great place to meet people. It's a great entry level. It's a great exit level job. And all of the things I just mentioned, there's so many amazing things. But like for us, like I have a hard time when people say, yes, in the short term, paying people more means you will make less. 12 months from now, paying people more and giving them appropriate benefits actually means you're going to make more. We have the
Isn't that interesting though, right? Because what you're really talking about is turnover. And so turnover has always been one of the measurements that we want to track people by. But what you're really talking about is we're in it for the long game, not the short game here. And especially when you see the shift of employees that are caused by outside influences like the pandemic, you know, it is the long game that wins.
It is. And that's the same thing with technology, is that companies that invested in tech, they knew that there was a massive disruption and industry shift going from analog to digital. They benefited from that. You're going to see the same thing with labor. It's a shift, right? So you're better off changing policy to benefit from it versus being the last one to actually do it. And turnover is a big portion of it, but it's also how people show up to work. And that's the culture of a pizza shop or the culture of a restaurant. When our guests walk in, they can feel that positive or negative energy that's being emitted from every single person there. And oftentimes you're more likely to have a positive experience when workers feel appreciated, supported, and engaged. That also shows up in the P&L. We have higher attachment, right? Which means that those at the cash are selling more because they're more invested. They talk more about the things that we're doing as a brand to our customers. And so our customers develop a deeper affinity for the actual brand itself because our employees talk about it. Right, the fact that we're able to share the things that we're doing with our customers vis-a-vis text message, make sure I can get anything that we're doing to our customers, and there's a great appreciation for that. And there are those on the other side that think, oh, and pizza's overly progressive. I will tell you that there's nothing that I'm saying or doing that's considered to be progressive when you talk to the workers themselves. And it's becoming now, Rob, very, very bipartisan. It may have been a partisan issue. I can tell you both sides of the aisle, They know wages need to increase. They know we have an issue in the restaurant, the food service industry. They know that it's broken and they want to fix it. And so they're looking into businesses like ourselves and brands like us as a case study for what's the right way to approach it. And so this is not about a left-leaning versus a right-leaning. This is about lifting up the lowest wage workers in America, which we all know is good for this country. It's about providing good jobs, which we know we used to provide, even though we had bad working conditions in manufacturing. The hourly wage that you were making was significantly higher, and people could stretch a dollar so much further, and that we've got to solve for this. And the only way that we solve for this is we put our best thinking together on both sides of the aisle, come together and create policy that works for the working class. But I always believe, and I will go to my deathbed with it, if it's good for the working class, it's good for America and it's good for society, and that's the focus.
So first of all, we have a lot of questions coming in, but I want to ask you, with your technology hat on for a second here, the one thing I will tell you is that both sides of the aisle have to eat, and the number of people on both sides of the aisle that either are restaurant owners or caught into, going into politics from being in restaurants, there's a lot of them out there. So we just know that we really sort of sit bipartisan in the middle. However, one of the things, being a tech guy, is robotics. And we have a lot of people talking about robotics. As a matter of fact, I went to an airport conference also put on by Clarion about 2 weeks ago, last week, in Dallas. And they had an automated pizza machine there. And I've seen the automated salad making machine with fresh salads. And this is making fresh pizzas as I got it. And they come out this slot, right? But a lot of people have been talking about Flippy, the hamburger maker, and the White Castle is doing, and Zune Pizza, was doing robotics to make their pizzas. I've been to their factory, and they were really I think a technology company that makes pizzas, like Tesla is a technology company that makes cars, right? So I'm sort of curious how you feel the impact of robotics is going to be, even in the labor market as it relates to the food service industry, whether it's delivery or production.
Yeah, I think that we've got a long ways to go. As much as I've studied robotics, and I think we've had our finger on the pulse. We've been partners with Zoom. They're investors in our business in terms of what our approach has been. It's just not there yet. And even when you look at sort of the speed of what a robotic produced pizza can, or a burger can actually create, it oftentimes is much slower than what a single person's two hands can do. And so we are a very, very, very long ways away from the actual replacement. That being said, the automation of very mundane tasks, right? Like, the rolling or sheeting of dough in a dough production factory, I very much think robotics is good for that. I also argue that's not necessarily a good job to be doing a mundane task. And so I look at the intersection of, robotics and actual people themselves as being a really good hybrid mix where you're creating safer working conditions. People are doing much less mundane tasks, but there's not a need for far fewer people. Now, you can take it to the extreme end, right? Like Elon Musk, where robots are going to replace all versions of future physical work, and thereby the need for universal basic income. I happen to be someone more on sort of the UBI side supporting that, and you could take it all the way there, which is something that we're going to have to address, but it's definitely not something in the next 3 to 5 years that's going to meaningfully change this industry. To me, it's more about 10, 20 years out, and how do we think about what a true good jobs thesis is in terms of, what percentage of work is done with people, what is done with robotics, and how do we thread that needle thoughtfully, and how do we make sure that the people who are doing work that matters the most and that they enjoy the most, and not the mundane tasks that a robot can potentially do better, faster, and less expensive.
Which, by the way, may make it a more exciting industry to be in if the mundane tasks, are taken out of the equation. Plus, smaller footprint, more interesting locations. I don't think it reduces at all, but it gives us additional opportunity. We did get a question from someone staying on this subject a little bit. You talked a lot about the analysis and figuring out where things were in the long term, which, by the way, takes a lot of data. And we've seen some restaurant companies recently investing in AI technologies, whether it's for throughput or whether it's scheduling. We have someone who's asked, where do you feel AI technology will play in restaurants and their ability to optimize existing employees?
Yeah, I think, again, AI is a little bit further behind than we'd like. It sounds really good, and we're sort of in the early innings of it being effective. I think it's mostly going to be effective in terms of the UX and the UI. So on the customer facing side, I can explain how we use it on the labor side in terms of optimizing menu and optimizing experiences around making sure that you're putting in front of someone what someone is most likely to purchase based on past behavior and also time of day and any sort of macro related data points that we can collect. I mean, we've been pretty early into AI because of the text message communications platform. We've got so much data on our customers, but there's just not a whole lot that you can do that's otherwise that helpful today. It will get there. The best thing that sort of AI has done for us is on the algorithm side is we're getting smarter and smarter about really thoughtful labor deployment and also about sort of make time minute and our algorithm around when a chit is fired off, right, based on when somebody is going to cross sort of the vortex or the threshold or the beacon as they're on their way to the pizza shop to fire off that pizza. So it's the net is that it's still very early innings. You could probably strip it completely out of and pizza and it wouldn't have much of a difference in terms of the business itself or the performance. But again, I think AI is probably more in the 2 to 3 years away for starting to make an impact. First, making an impact on the menu and on the user experience and user interface side, and then working its way, i.e. to get people what they want and really help improve top line and really help improve attachment, and then moving on to the labor side thereafter, but it's not quite there yet.
All right, so we have another question, and I'll tell you, I took a look at this question and I think about how history comes back around. But I remember, I cannot remember his last name, but a very well-known restaurateur of an independent restaurant in California who did away with tips many years ago. I bet it's like 20 years ago, and boy, did he catch a lot of hell about it in the industry. So somebody's asked, from a global perspective, the U.S. is often laughed at for using lower hourly rate and gratuity wages. Do you see any movement towards the more common global practice to include gratuity embedded in the menu item price as a strategy towards paying actual living wage to our servers and bartenders?
Yeah, we're moving down that path. I mean, the one fair wage is a pretty powerful movement that's gaining traction. We're actually speaking to local DC legislation this week on behalf of one fair wage. So it's absolutely something that I think is going to be the future. It's just, sometimes America is a little bit further behind on progressive labor policy, but I do think with globalization, with letting other countries lead and what we've been able to learn from it, that it is ultimately going to be, a very good thing for the industry. And it will be a level set. And I think that balancing act will help all restaurants, not just sort of the top restaurants that attract the top servers because they can make the most amount of tips. But when you think about, the restaurant in Biloxi, Mississippi, being able to attract and be able to afford the same labor as Manhattan, I don't look at that as a bad thing. I look at it as a very good thing for the industry. Because again, the whole objective is about, rising up and getting people all on a similar wage. So we don't have the wage discrepancy. It also is going to eliminate things like sexual harassment and discrimination, right? Which from that perspective can be absolutely brutal in terms of based on physical appearance, how people are treated and the amount of income they can earn, which it's a really tough thing and a really big drag. And even you talk to those people, it's often a reason why people leave, because over time, even if they were the beneficiaries of it, they don't like it and they ultimately move on to something else.
Well, we also see, I went to a conference last week in Florida, and they were talking about commission-based wages that they're also trying in different parts as well. We have someone who's asked a question. Another challenge that goes unspoken is that the hospitality industry is in demand on the weekends and late at night. How does this shift to equate to a work-life balance in the industry? I used to joke that I have no work-life balance. It's all work. I don't know, but that is a concern that people have, and how do you, you're talking about doing a lot of different things for people. How do you bring in the work-life balance into an industry that does have such odd hours and very demanding?
Yeah, well, it depends on what side of the industry. If you're in, QSR, fast casual, fine dining, or any kind of, name that you can make up in between, I think each of them has different benefits. In our business is completely split 50% lunch, 50% dinner, which is a bit odd for a pizza chain, but we've introduced pizza as a lunch option in the markets that we serve. And so from that perspective, most of our workers can choose whether they want, the early part of the day, the AM, early PM or PM, and it works out quite well. So I would say that what that question is typically skewed to is more on the fine dining side, where restaurants open at 5 p.m. and maybe go later, and that's going to be something that for that side of the industry, there's no real cure for that. That's following trends, that's meeting customers where they are, and quite frankly, like that's their entire value proposition, which happens to be dinner and booze and a really good time. So I would say that if you look across the industry, it's not disproportionately skewed to the evening, that it is the daytime. Just it's industry by industry, concept by concept. And I do think there are plenty of concepts out there that offer very stable Monday through Friday jobs in terms of the quote unquote punching the clock that work for so many people.
Yeah, I think that you're pointing out something, that I've discovered as well, is that a lot of people think that the industry is only a certain type of job, and there are all kinds of jobs, and there are all kinds of operations jobs as well, as you've just pointed out, in the contract on-site feeding and different types of areas that they have as well. So we really only have a couple more minutes here. And someone has asked a question, and it would be good to just get your perspective on this. They'd like to know, what practices does And Pizza take to enforce and educate the policies that you've put in place in order to create a better workplace?
So we largely use text message. It's been one of the greatest, I don't want to say innovations because it's not innovative, it's actually how people communicate, right? It's been one of the greatest shifts from a communication standpoint. When you think about how a lot of companies communicate, it's like a bad game of telephone when you played as a kid growing up, right? What that first person says as it gets to the 50th person around the room changes dramatically. And so we've done both a lot of education and a lot of training as it relates to getting our leadership and our managers up to speed, but we also communicate directly with every hourly worker with the press of a button. And so we're constantly sending out video, we're constantly sending out copy, we're constantly sending out everything and anything that you can imagine to our hourly workforce directly intraday to make sure that they're getting the same information that everyone else is getting. In some instances, they're getting it faster. So even in the first couple of weeks of COVID, I was on every single day on video talking about no different than former Governor Cuomo was, and probably not the best use case or reference right now, but point being, the one thing that I think he did well was communicate daily about what was happening, put everything else aside. That did calm people's nerves, and we deployed something very similar where we did communicate every single day with our workforce around what we knew, what we were hearing, how that was going to affect what we were doing at And Pizza. And it was largely beneficial because people at least knew what we were going on. They never had to question, am I going to lose my job? Because I was there talking, holding the mic every single day, telling them exactly what was going to happen. And we do the same thing with our policy, right? Educating them around, what does 3 days of paid time off for activism actually mean? How do I get to use it? It means you can take off 3 days, however you define activism, and get out there, right? And do ultimately what you want to do to give back. And we very loosely enforce it because the reality is my path to activism as a human being started off with meeting other people that had a similar point of view and them encouraging me to use my voice that I didn't know that I had. And that was it, right? Maybe I was talking initially to 5 people and that became 500 people, et cetera, et cetera. But the rallies and the marches that I attended around increasing wages, and we got the wage increase in Washington, D.C. in 5 different jurisdictions. I've introduced 2 pieces of legislation on Capitol Hill with Senator Sanders, Senator Pelosi, Senator Schumer. That only happened because someone encouraged me to speak, encourage me to go out there and do our thing. And that's what the policy is really about, which is trying to encourage our kids, get out there.
We are at the end of our time, but I just would like to ask you, if you don't mind, if you're giving people the choice to follow their passion for activism and to do something good. I get that you're giving them a passion in the industry because the way you work with your employees, and that's what makes a difference. But could you just in a moment or two just share 1 or 2 things that some of your people have taken you up on, maybe something interesting that they've done to take advantage of those 3 days of activism?
Yeah, I mean, we're the beneficiary being headquartered in Washington, D.C., where there isn't a week that goes by where there's not some version of a protest. And so I would just say that every march that gets featured, right, nationally, we at least have one or two And Pizza employees and workers that are on the ground participating and, feeling heard. And I think that's a really cool thing. And so for us, I do think the policy specifically helps that we're here and we have a lot of pizza shops in Washington, D.C. But that's been the coolest thing that I've seen, from women's marches to pride marches to everything in between, just hearing from people that they got a chance to meet people that felt similar. And a lot of these kids, by the way, and I know I can be long-winded, they don't grow up knowing that this is an option. They don't go to the marches because unless you have a family system or structure or someone teaches you that this is a way that you can meet like-minded people and feel like you're part of a community that isn't an information bubble on social media, which that also helps break. It's such a great way to get out there and develop your own network of people that you can share, talk to, be inspired by, and hopefully inspire.
Well, so listen, I want to thank you very much for being our speaker today. Labor in our industry is obviously a very, very important subject. And I think your take on it and the way that you're approaching it and the way And Pizza is approaching it, is one that would inspire people and get them to say industry a choice, but the industry is going to take care of them as well if we make some changes and we, continue down that path. I do want to apologize again to our audience for some of the video problems we had, but you should have been able to hear us throughout the whole thing on this very interesting conversation that we had. And I would remind you that this webinar will be featured on foodandbeverageshows.com, the IFBTA.org, and other social media sites. And Michael, I know you're only a few miles away, so perhaps we'll get to meet up at some point, but we really appreciate your time today and also WorkStream for sponsoring this conversation in labor in the food service industry. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you for having me.